Hi, everybody. It's Mary Rowe from the Canadian Urban Institute. So pleased to have you joining us for what is going to be a marathon. It's like an urban telethon is what I've been describing it as. We have hundreds of people joining online. And of course, as you know, it's going to take a few minutes for people to be able to log on. And Zoom, bless their hearts, changed some of the technical requirements. And so apologies in advance for those of you like me that had a hell of a time trying to actually get yourself registered and on. So we're going to be forgiving in that way. Obviously that some people are getting on quickly, other people not so much. But the benefit of a 4-hour program is that eventually people will find their way to this channel. I'm in Toronto, and I want to bring you greetings from all the folks that are engaged in this process across the country, and particularly for us to think about the ancestral territories and traditions and the continuing ongoing challenge we have around truth and reconciliation. And so rather than doing a standard land acknowledgement, we've asked two of our colleagues to come on and set us off in the right tone here in terms of how do we actually begin this reflection in a way that is reflective of Indigenous realities, Indigenous history, Indigenous traditions. And so I'm very pleased to have Alexandra Cropp joining us, who is with Mokwateh. She'll tell you where she's from. She's a great colleague for us, and we're developing programs together. And Steve DeRoy, who always inspires me with those guitars behind him. Steve, who is the senior, well, he's actually the director, he's the poobah of the Firelight group, just recently recognized with an important award about his contributions, which we are very proud of, Steve. And Steve actually sits on the CUI board. So thanks you two for joining us. Just before you start, I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping things, as I suggested. So it's a process to get people registered and get them on. The good thing, as you guys know, is we record these sessions, we post them, people watch them again and again on a Saturday night when you're kind of low, haven't got much to do. You can watch one of these sessions. The chat is a really vibrant parallel universe, and we encourage everybody that's coming on to enjoy that with us and engage in those conversations. And as you all know, we publish the chat. So what goes in the chat stays in the chat. And this is really the beginning, as we always say at City Talk, this is the beginning of an ongoing conversation. And today is unbelievably COVID 1000. So I'm going to pass to my my colleagues for them to give us some reflection. 1000 doesn't deter these two. And I think, Alex, you're going first. Am I right? And thanks for joining us on City Talk. We're going to be on the clock very religiously for the next 4 hours to get as many people on as we can. And I really, really appreciate you two setting us off on the right foot. So over to you, Alex.
Thanks, Mary. Good morning, everyone. I'm incredibly excited to be here. So thank you for letting me join you in this important conversation. My name is Alexandra Cropp. I'm from Norway House Cree Nation, so I'm from Manitoba. I recently relocated to Toronto back in July. I had the honor and privilege actually of being able to work for my community. So after I finished post-secondary education, I did some traveling, as many do. I was then able to seek employment with my community. And so I was able to really lead a large health division. So kind of managing a large budget there, as well as our staff, incorporating key programs such as Jordan's Principle, other areas that really kind of impact our health and our community members. I also was able to then pivot over to leading a large capital infrastructure project in Norway House. So we were replacing one of the remaining 2 existing Indian hospitals left in Canada. So I think most may be aware, but within the residential school system, there were also a lot of Indian hospitals, keeping us segregated, keeping us up in the north in our communities. And so with that, there is a dark history, and as well as some unfortunate realities that happened within the hospital. So I was able to help work with my community and replace that facility. So they're in the process of doing so. The community has been integral to that process, which I think is some key learnings that we can take as we look to those next 1,000 days post-COVID, and how to really make sure that we're actually including Indigenous people in the conversation. And then I think a little bit more about myself is that I have since relocated. Mary is slowly helping me learn the city, taking me to different places, getting me kind of oriented. And I'm incredibly fortunate to be here because in my role as Senior Manager of Operations at Mokwateh, we really want to find ways that we're supporting our community. Our kind of genesis is supporting government, industry, and community in building meaningful relationships and partnerships. So what that means to us is just making sure that we're not just checking off a box saying, yes, we've done our consultation process, but actually including our Indigenous peoples in that process, and then empowering them with the tools to then lead their own economic development opportunities, lead their own partnerships, so that they're the one driving that process. So as I noted, my name is Alexandra Cropp. My given name is Vanessa Wiswaganescu, and I'm just going to kind of touch on some of my perspective from community-based learnings from COVID-19, kind of what I hope that we can kind of do as a group moving forward. And then I'm going to leave it to all of you amazing people to kind of lead that, if you will. Yeah, so I'll just kind of jump into some of my notes. As some of you may not know, I do love notes, so I like to follow through with them. Here we are, COVID-19. It's really transformed the way we live our lives. An example being we are now sitting individually in our own homes or our offices connecting here today. And one thing that's really been kind of an unfortunate byproduct of COVID-19 among many is that it's further amplified our disproportionate impacts for Indigenous peoples and how we face our day-to-day lives in Canada. Not only respect to our access to housing, clean water, education, health, community-based economic development opportunities, and our presence at the policymaking table. While we continue to make our shifts to online platforms, we were unable to do so because of our lack of access to reliable connectivity. So as you may know, after we kind of leave those city centers, connectivity really drops. And it makes it very difficult for our community members and our people to just kind of participate in the economy. So as we returned home seeking safe shelter, personal connections, as well as taking care of our family and loved ones during the pandemic, we inadvertently gave up our ability to continue with some employment opportunities in bigger cities. We gave up our access to education sometimes and some of our relationships. And now I recognize that that's not solely an Indigenous or Indigenous focused loss, if you will, but our homes and community are typically so far away. Mine, Norway House from Winnipeg, is an 8.5-hour drive, a 6-hour drive on the winter road, and possibly a 2-hour flight on a very dodgy metro plane going up north. And that's if there's no complications. So it really ended up leaving us out of that conversation as it relates to finding solutions for our people and relying on others to make those decisions on our behalf, not only for our safety during the pandemic, but also how we're actually going to move about and kind of support the, if you will, Canada and those areas. As I noted, I'm a new resident in Toronto, and I'm constantly searching for my Indigenous presence here. In Manitoba, I knew exactly where to go. I knew where to get my bannock. I knew where to get my herbs. I knew where to access Indigenous-based COVID-19 vaccines and testing. I really kind of knew where to do that. And here in Toronto, I'm slowly kind of finding that way. And that's what's great about the partnership with CUI, is that they're really kind of focusing on how do we bring back that Indigenous presence, not only in Toronto, but other cities. And then how do we support those Indigenous communities in their own prosperity and their own economic development? So with that, what do we need to do for the next 1,000 days coming forward? And how are we kind of really going to make sure that we're finding a place for all in our communities, and especially when we're away from our home? So as I assume many of you are aware, and I know that we have some strong leaders here today, is that historically the development of our cities, neighborhoods, and communities and homes are done so with little to no Indigenous participation. Our built environments have predominantly been through a settler lens, contributing to the invisibility of Indigenous people and minimizing our cultural presence and influence on those spaces. And so this is why Indigenous placemaking is so important, because we can empower our urban inhabitants in their cultural representation through the advancement of projects and initiatives that promote that truth and reconciliation efforts. So kind of going beyond, as I noted, that checkbox or that tokenism, and truly incorporating Indigenous peoples and our knowledge, not only through the required consultation process, but through each phase of the design and planning process, to participation, and dare I say leading at one point, of also promoting Indigenous workforces meant to build the vision of that long-term sustainable operations of any facility, and kind of just making sure that Indigenous people are at the forefront as we move forward. Really strengthening our connections and increasing visible presence, encouraging natural dialogue and safe and open opportunities for those who wish to learn. I am really a strong believer that we can't shame people who ask certain questions. There really is no stupid question or no dumb question in life. I think as an Indigenous person, it's my role, and my role in society is my friendships, to make sure that I'm continuing to support my friends, family, and strangers that actually do want to learn, because ultimately the only way that they're going to learn is that if we work together to understand our different backgrounds, our different perspectives, and how can we kind of come to somewhat of a resolution together, whether it be the same, but we're all kind of focusing on supporting society. So really also just kind of creating that space that both physical and in policy development. So enabling our youth and Indigenous leaders to not only have that connection to our teachings and knowledge, but allowing them the opportunity to share this knowledge with everyone here today, of course, as well as others that we meet along every day, offering those unique Indigenous perspectives and approaches to urban design that has rarely been achieved in the context of contemporary colonialism. So really my kind of 2 cents, if you will, moving forward, and what I learned with helping the development of the Norway House Nation Health Center of Excellence is just having Indigenous people present. We are typically a spoken community. We kind of talk through histories and lessons and stories. And I think there's a lot to learn from there. So just having the patience and just making sure that you're coming with open ears and ready to kind of learn, and also not be offended when you've been informed that maybe this is a different practice, or we're recommending a different approach to the next time you may engage with Indigenous peoples, communities, or whatever that may be. Yeah, so that's kind of my 2 cents. I hope that was somewhat informative. My apologies, I also do talk quite fast. And I wish you all the best, and I'll hand it back to Mary and then Steve.
I can pass right over to Steve. Alexandra, thank you. Thank you for sharing your experience. And I should just say that, you know, these are my colleagues who said a land acknowledgement doesn't cut it. You've got to have something much more substantive to start off this 1,000-day event. So that's why we're very appreciative that both of you are taking time. Thanks, Alexandra. Over to you, Steve.
Okay, bonjour. Blue Water Drum Man Indigenous, Steve Indigenous, Ebb and Flow First Nation, Lake Manitoba First Nation, and Treaty 2 in Dunjaba. Basically, I've said hello. My name is Blue Water Drum Man. People call me Steve, and I'm from the Ebb and Flow First Nation and Lake Manitoba First Nations in Treaty 2 territory. I'm speaking to you today from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation in North Vancouver, British Columbia. And I walk between two worlds. One is the ceremonial world where I do ceremonies and Sundance. And then I have a professional space where I have a company called the Firelight Group, and we do work with Indigenous communities from coast to coast to coast. And as Mary said, while acknowledgements do show a recognition and respect for Indigenous peoples, they also tend to oversimplify the complex histories of Indigenous peoples and fail to recognize the ongoing impacts of colonization that continues today. So I've been asked to give a bit of perspective on land acknowledgements. And so I ask that you take the following actions to cultivate strong relationships with Indigenous peoples in your work as you move forward today. And I've got a few stories I'm going to tell as I do this in an educational way. But first, number one, I would suggest the first action be give land back to Indigenous peoples. Two, in 1982, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was established by the United Nations Commission on Human Rights. Jose R. Martinez Coco led a study about the systematic discrimination of Indigenous peoples worldwide. It's from this study that the Working Group on Indigenous Populations began to draft a Declaration of Indigenous Rights in 1985, based on consultations with Indigenous representatives from around the world. The Working Group submitted their first draft in 1994, and with the formation of the United Nations Human Rights Council in 2006, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was adopted in 2007. UNDRIP deals with a wide spectrum of Indigenous rights and contains 46 articles as a standard of achievement to be pursued. I call on you today to work towards implementing the 46 articles of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. 3, in the summer of 1990, a 78-day standoff known as the Oka Crisis occurred between Kanesatake protesters, Quebec police, the RCMP, and the Canadian Army. As a result, the federal government established the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1991. Extensive research and community consultations focused on historical and contemporary relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, and had 4 theme areas: governance, land and economy, social and cultural issues, and the North. The resulting 5-volume report was released in 1996 and concluded the need for a complete restructuring of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples in Canada, and contained 440 recommendations for how to do so. I call on you today to work towards implementing the 440 recommendations of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. 4, in 2007, the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement, the largest class action settlement in Canadian history, was finalized. One of the elements of the agreement was to establish the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada to help foster reconciliation amongst former students, their families, their communities, and all of Canada. From 2007 to 2015, the TRC documented experiences from over 6,500 witnesses. The findings from this effort formed a multi-volume report, which included 94 calls to actions or recommendations to further reconciliation between Canadians and Indigenous peoples. I call on you today to work towards implementing the 94 calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. 5, in 2004, Amnesty International released a report called Stolen Sisters, a human rights response to discrimination and violence against Indigenous women in Canada, due to the appalling number of Indigenous women who are victims of racialized and sexualized violence. The Native Women's Association of Canada carried out research and provided awareness about violence against Indigenous women and launched the Sisters in Spirit initiative. From their research, they developed a national database to track cases of violence against Indigenous women and released a report entitled What Their Stories Tell Us, Research Findings from the Sisters in Spirit initiative. The Legal Strategy Coalition on the Violence Against Indigenous Women was formed in 2014, and they released a report with over 700 recommendations and calls to action. In 2014, the Commissioner of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police released Missing and Murdered Aboriginal Women, a national operational overview, which documented 1,181 people from 1980 to 2012, and later added an additional 11 Indigenous women who were missing. In 2015, the Canadian government launched the National Public Inquiry, and in 2019, the inquiry's final report, titled Reclaiming Power and Place, was released. More than 2,380 people participated in the national inquiry, including testimonies, public hearings, and evidence gathering efforts. The report contained 231 individual legal imperatives or calls for justice for Indigenous women, girls, and two-spirit, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, and asexual people. I call on you to work towards implementing the 231 calls for justice from the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. And 6, invest in and support Indigenous economies. This requires corporate Canada to adjust their supply chains and develop Indigenous procurement strategies. It also requires financial institutions to reduce barriers for accessing financing. Capacity building with Indigenous peoples will promote strong investment and equity opportunities, as well as a strong economic relationship with Indigenous peoples. So with that, I say enough with the land acknowledgements. Please go do the work.
Indeed. Thank you, Steve. I mean, I kept a list of this and, you know, it's 14, it's like 2,000 particular actions to take. I'm appreciating there are probably some duplications, but still, as you say, and as we always try to remind ourselves, you know, city building is not for the faint of heart and that the work is never over. You know, we always have things that we need to be continuing to work on. And as you suggested, it's not like we don't know what we need to be doing in this particular domain of how we actually indigenize our cities and put ourselves into proper right relationships. So I appreciate both of you coming on, Alexandra and Steve, and setting us into this path for the next several hours when we think about the next 1,000 days and what do we need to recommit to. And we're going to dig around and hopefully find the list, Steve, because I know you've gone through those 6 items before at the board, and hopefully we'll be able to post them. If not, folks, we will post them on the website subsequently. And as I've said, these sessions are all recorded, so you'll be able to hear more, again, Alexandra's very personal experience. And we look forward to continuing to work with both of you on this process that CUI is part of, and all of the city builders across the country. Thanks you two for coming on and getting us started. I appreciate it. I hope you'll stay on if you can. And I look forward to when we next cross paths. Thanks.